Essay structure, basic example of one. You don't have to all use this. Obviously, you can do what you like with your structures and you might have your own preferences. One, I'm just going to give you a general way. If anyone's kind of stuck on a structure, this is one thing that I find very helpful. I just think about doing a 3-body paragraph structure. For when you're doing an essay on one text, I like 3 bodies. The first paragraph, I like to focus on the problem, the initial problem or conflict that we're confronted with, that the protagonist is confronted with, that Ishiguro is addressing. What's the problem? What's the key problem tension to begin with? Okay? Then in the second body, I like to talk about the response to that. So if there is a problem for Ono, how does he deal with it? What's his response to it? What's his coping mechanism? And then at the end, is it resolved? Can he overcome the problem? Now, do you see how, as I've explained that, what do you notice about the essay if you follow that kind of structure? What is the essay going to do, which it should do? It's going to move forward, right? But barely anyone does this. Now, resolution, by the way, you don't have to say there is one, and I think that's where you can stand out. You actually want to critically think, does Ono resolve the problem? And let's say the problem is he needs to accept what? Moral responsibility. It's hard to know whether he really does, but there's some evidence in the text to say, oh, he's starting to admit to his mistakes, and there are moments where he says that, but then there's other reasons to think he's just saying that and he doesn't actually mean it, right? So you can kind of get critical there as to whether there is a resolution, and I think that's what you can discuss in the last body. The main thing I'm trying to highlight, though, is that you want to make sure your essays move forward. A lot of people just pick 3 themes and just write about 3 themes. That shouldn't be the case. It should be the case, you can have 3 themes, but you need to make sure there's a reason that the first body paragraph is the first body paragraph. Would you be able to put your third body paragraph as the first and it still work the same? We want it to sound really strange if you shifted around your body paragraphs. It should only make sense one way. So really have a think about that. It doesn't mean you have to redo all of your work that you've already done. It's just I would suggest trying to reframe things so that your topic sentences and your links are actually pushing the argument forward, using words like consequently in the second paragraph. Right? If you started the second paragraph with a word like consequently, what does it sound like? It sounds like you're going to say the effect of the first paragraph. Well, that's going to force you to now move forward. And then in the last one, you might say, however, and then say, oh, he's not able to overcome it or something. So that way, just use the right words like consequently, however, things like that are going to force you to do the right thing here, which is to make sure your argument's going forward. What's the problem with us looking at Ono's perspective? Like, what's his struggle? What is he trying to do? What's he attached to? The past. So he's attached to the past. Okay, so that could, but the problem is that his perspective of the past is what? Because it's kind of shaped by memories. Memory is fallible. Everyone say fallible. How you remember yesterday, you might get some details wrong, right? So when he's looking back, his perspective is not a reliable one, right? It's unreliable, it's fallible, and we know that actually allows him to reconstruct the past to try and vindicate, just like validate his role or his identity pre-World War II. But he's just presented with more and more evidence that perhaps that wasn't actually the right thing to do, and that his perspective was very what? Narrow. Does anyone know another word for narrow? Parochial. He can't see beyond his worldview, can he? Which is all about reputation, all about respecting your elders, very traditional. He has traditional values. He can't see beyond it and embrace the new democratic values because that would require him to actually accept that what he did wasn't completely moral or ethical. All right, so here's an example. If you just want an example, 3 things I could talk about. Again, I've mentioned the word fallible. If I was to talk about a problem, well, I would say, okay, Ono has a very limited and fallible perspective of the past. That's going to be very challenging for us as readers then, because it's written in first person. Then I like to go into kind of Ono's resistance to the present. Okay, if he's going to resist the present, then he's fighting against this new cultural zeitgeist. That's a nice word. Zeitgeist means like the spirit of the time. Okay, there's a new spirit, isn't there? That more westernized, democratic spirit. The old cultural zeitgeist is now redundant. It's outdated. So he needs to move, and he resists that. And then the last one is the question of whether Ono does assume moral responsibility. By the way, these are just examples. You can choose your own things to focus on. Does Ono assume moral responsibility by the end? And you can make that argument. Some people argue yes, and there's some evidence for that. And then some people can say it looks like it, but actually we can't believe him, and you can provide evidence for that. Does that make sense? Because again, we don't know how much he actually means when he says it. How much is he saying just to please people and seem like he's doing the right thing? But there's a lot of evidence to suggest he really just wants the world to go back how it was. When you're summarizing the themes, right, remember I said you need to deliver the themes in that kind of that order that makes sense in the essay. That's how you want to represent them. I like to just figure out what is the core tension, what's the core problem. That's going to be my thesis, and then you can figure out how some of the other themes that are explored kind of fit into that. But remember, you've got to probably have three, if you're doing a 3-body paragraph structure, 3 concepts that all stem from one like overarching problem. So the self-deception point, does everyone understand that? Ono deceiving himself of how much he was to blame for what happened in World War II, and then having to adjust to the new paradigm, right? To a more Western, democratic Japan, a new Japan, that requires him to accept some moral responsibility for his contribution to the war. Okay, so he's tempted to deceive himself, or he can assume moral responsibility and try and move on. But it's very difficult to do that. That's the core problem. And then there's other themes that play into all of that. We've talked about cultural change, nostalgia, how he retreats back into his memory. He almost finds some comfort in certain memories, right? And we all know about that. Like, people can remember things and it makes you happy. And he's always going back to the past, right? Because he kind of lives in the past, wouldn't you say? To clarify, what I mean is when you're developing a thesis, for instance, I like to think, okay, what's the core tension? What is the core tension? Well, he can deceive himself, or he has to accept a new paradigm, a new worldview that requires him to accept moral responsibility. So you start with that. That's kind of like your thesis, the core problem. Then what I'm saying is here are just some general themes that you would then need to articulate in a way that would then fit into that structure. So you can draw upon those themes to develop these 3 arguments, if that makes sense. Let me give you an example. One of the themes there said ideological or cultural change. I've got in the second paragraph, I'm going to focus on his resistance to that new culture, that new cultural spirit, right? So it's more that you can draw upon these themes in the yellow boxes. This is just a suggestion. And then tie them into some of those arguments as long as the framework moves forward. Like, for instance, I didn't have there anything about art or the purpose of art, but that's a really great thing to explore in an essay, and you can tie art into that framework. So when we're talking about the purpose of art, what's the tension there with the purpose of art? Like, what does Ono initially do with his art, and then what does he end up doing when he becomes a propaganda artist? Let's start with this. There was a shift in how Ono viewed art. To begin with, when he was younger, he said art's just a great way of capturing the beauty of something. It's more like impressionistic. Just, I'll see something, I'll capture its beauty. That's what he used to think. And then slowly, he started to use art for a more functional as a functional device. So there's actually a purpose behind his art. My art is going to make a political statement. So everyone, if you're going to write about art, make sure you talk about how art is politicized in the end by Ono.